Dr. Ian Fairlie is Vice President of Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He's also an expert in radioactivity, and you can find a couple of his publications on the Scottish C&D website, and we will include these in the chats. Maybe, Christina, you can pop that in there.
Tomorrow will be the 38th anniversary of the Chernobyl accident on April the 26th, 1986. By the way, the reason for the different spelling is that Chernobyl is the Ukrainian spelling and Chernobyl is the Russian spelling. So for obvious reasons, well, the reactor was in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government prefers that we say Chernobyl, so I'm following that. These are some of the quotations said at the time or shortly after by officialdom. They called Chernobyl the foremost nuclear catastrophe in human history. It's pretty serious. And it says, then the IAEA says later, the size of the, its magnitude and scope of the size of the populations and long-term consequences make it the worst industrial disaster on record. Wow. There you go. And the radioactivity was 200 times greater than that at Hiroshima. Here's a picture of the ruined reactor 4 at Chernobyl. This is where the reactor once was. You can just see the bottom, the rim of the reactor base there. And this here is the turbine hall. And these holes are caused by the debris which have been ejected into the air, falling and landing on the roof. Here's another picture taken a few years later, showing the extent of the disaster. It was truly a monumental catastrophe. The key thing is we want to look at the fallout from the reactor. This is a timeline from the Lawrence Livermore Research Laboratory in the United States. Came from OECD. And here, where my cursor is pointing, is what Chernobyl is. And this is on the first day. This is April the 26th here. Here is 2 days later, April the 28th. You can see the fallout that's spreading. It's basically carried by the prevailing winds and rainfall. And here you can see it spreading further. This is May the 1st. This is May the 2nd, May the 3rd. This is where the fallout reaches Britain late on May the 1st. Here it is a few days later, May the 3rd, and here it is May the 5th. Okay, so, and you can see it's spread throughout the whole of Europe. This is a map of the consolidated amount of the fallout throughout Europe. You can see the fallout was smeared all over Europe. This is where the accident was, where I'm pointing here, Chernobyl. Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine really got it badly, but other countries really got it badly too, like Finland, Sweden, Austria, Norway, and the western parts of the UK. Now, let's focus in on that. This is the UK. This is the fallout in the UK late on May the 1st and into the evening of May the 1st and the start of May the 2nd. You can see that it was the west coast that where the fallout occurred. It was raining at that time, and this is where the fallout is, including Ireland, by the way. But you may say, well, what about Scotland? Well, here's Scotland. It's a bit fuzzy because I've enlarged it, but here's the fallout in Scotland, and you can see the fallout was mainly in the southwest, in the Grampians, and in the Lothian areas, and also in central Scotland here too. The words here, it says Edinburgh University, and at the university there were some measuring devices. That's why they put in bold letters here. So let's go on. What were the increased ill health effects? Well, there was thyroid cancers, there were leukemias, which are blood cancers, by the way, solid cancers, non-cancer effects, for example, cardiovascular system effects, that includes stroke, Down syndrome, and there were also some mental health and psychosocial effects too. But the first 5 here are the main effects, main ill health effects. There were 2 Touch reports, one in 2006 by myself and David Sumner, who's perhaps listening to this. There was a later report in 2016 by myself. And these estimated that there would be, roughly speaking, 60,000 future cancer deaths, depending on which assumptions you took on board. But 60,000 is a fairly average figure compared with many of the figures from other sources. This is 15 times the IAEA's estimate of 4,000 deaths, future cancer deaths. It's estimated there would be about 18,000 cases of thyroid cancer. That's from Elizabeth Cardis. Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia were very heavily contaminated, but about half of the fallout was deposited outside these countries. BUR stands for Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And about 40% of the land area of Europe was contaminated to a significant extent. You may ask, what about Scotland? Well, there was one study found by accident, a statistically significant increase in Down syndrome infants in 1986 in Lothian. Down syndrome, by the way, for those people who may be unfamiliar, is used to be called Mongolism. It's not called that now, of course. And this is the conclusion. It found a time association between the cluster of cases and the events at Chernobyl. But it also said that there was no biologically plausible explanation to link the 2 events. This is the actual study here at the bottom, by Ramsey Al-Zili, published in a rather obscure journal, Biomedicine and Pharmacotherapy, in 1991. Now, the key thing from that study is this graph here. See, the x-axis shows the years, the time, and you can see that in 1987, there was a spike, because in the previous years, there was a gentle decline in the number of Down syndrome babies being born. But in 87, it basically doubled, and the incidence rate per 10,000 births. Well, why did that occur? Well, I have a plausible explanation for that. The first question is, did it occur in other countries? Well, yes, it did. Here are a number of other studies, such as Germany, Finland, Hungary, Sweden, West Berlin, and even in England, and Europe-wide. So you can see there's 8 studies here showing Down syndrome after Chernobyl. In most people's view, this would be fairly strong evidence that there was an increase in Down syndrome. But when I spoke to a couple of the authors of the Scottish report, they still refused to accept it, which I find, not Ramsey, by the way, but the other 2 authors, they found it. Both of them were very pro-nuclear, in my view. So here we are, 30 years later, in 2004, the nuclear establishment, that means IAEA, UNSCEAR, ICRP, they're still refusing to acknowledge the true scale of health effects. They're not carried out any official epidemiology. They've not given financial help to Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And it's a shameful blot on the reputations of the nuclear establishment, in my view. And it raises questions about nuclear power, the accident. for example, and I've listed about 5 of them here. Is it prudent for us to ignore the possibility of more accidents? I would suggest it's not. There already has been a major accident in 2011 at Fukushima. Well, the question is nuclear power a sustainable development? Well, I would suggest not, given the amounts of high active waste which result from nuclear power. Is it consistent with the precautionary principle? Because that means, if in doubt, leave it out, basically. In other words, call county. If there's evidence which would suggest perhaps there's an effect, take it seriously. Is it ethical for us to pass on radioactive waste to future generations? Ethical is hardly an adjective that I would use to describe that. And also, is it ethical for the increased problems with nuclear weapons proliferation? I mean, look what's going on right now, this very minute in Iran. Now, I'm going to finish off now, my 10 minutes allotted time. Many years ago, in the 1940s, George Santayana, he's an Italian-American philosopher, he said that governments who are unable to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. In other words, we shouldn't be going down the nuclear line.
For now, I'd like to welcome Pete Roach, who, amongst other things, is an environmental and nuclear power consultant and is also the founder of the No to Nuclear Power website. So over to you, Pete.
So I just wanted to take 5 minutes really to make sure that everybody is up to speed with what the political situation is in Scotland regarding nuclear power. I need to get rid of this. Here we go. So the Scottish Government's policy is that they oppose the building of new nuclear power stations using current technologies. So remember that phrase, current technologies. It could prove to be important in future. I won't bother with the rest of the quote, but you can probably get hold of these slides afterwards. I'll send them to Kat for circulation. So we were at the Nuclear Free Local Authorities, we were interested in whether this current technologies was something we needed to worry about. So the UK government are busy trying to plan for 24 gigawatts of new nuclear power stations. To give you an idea, Hinkley Point C is 3.2 gigawatts. So it's quite a lot of Hinkley Point Cs. We're used in this country to the government proposing large nuclear power stations, and indeed they're about to start building, provided they get through the investment decision. Another one, a carbon copy of Hinkley Point C at Sizewell in Suffolk. But they're also quite keen in these new things called small modular reactors. Small modular reactors are the ones that are being looked at the moment. There's 6 different types. They're basically the same as large reactors, but smaller. But there's also another type of reactor that they're looking at and putting money into, which are called advanced modular reactors. So we wanted to make sure that the Scottish Government wasn't going to use that phrase, current technologies, to either get through some small modular reactors up here or indeed some advanced modular reactors. So first of all, the Scottish Government made this announcement about small modular reactors, and they said, while small modular reactors are innovative in their size and construction techniques, they use the same method of electricity generation as traditional nuclear fission, and they have the same environmental concerns as traditional nuclear power. So far, so good. And so we wrote to them to make sure that this also applied to advanced modular reactors. And they said, we agree with your analysis that the UK government's plans for advanced modular reactors will be expensive and are unlikely to be ready in time to contribute towards Scotland's ambition of being net zero by 2045. Significant growth in renewables and storage provides the best pathway to net storage, pointing out that, I believe that the SNP would have these policies, whether or not the Greens had been sharing the burden of government or not. So that's worth knowing. But since the Greens have been kicked out of government today, but it's a possibility that because of the events today, we might end up with a general election in Scotland. It depends on what the opposition parties decide to do. But as you probably heard already, Douglas Ross, the leader of the Tories, has put down a vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf, and I believe that's going to be supported by Labour and the Lib Dems. Now, what would happen if that vote gets through, which is quite a possibility given that the SNP don't have a majority anymore, is that they would need to pick another leader. But if the SNP were to choose somebody like Kate Forbes, for example, it's unlikely that the Greens would support Kate Forbes as First Minister. So if they can't find another First Minister to replace Humza Yousaf, then we have to go to a general election. And Scottish Labour's policy is much worse than it used to be when they were in government. Anas Sarwar says using nuclear energy could ease the cost of living crisis in the long term. God knows where he gets that idea from. Nuclear and the highly paid skilled jobs it brings must be part of Scotland's energy mix, he says. Scotland now risks paying the price in lost jobs and opportunities for the SNP's unscientific and economically backward opposition to nuclear energy. So that's a bit of a worry and something that we should bear in mind if we are heading towards an election in future. That's basically all that I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Pete. We've heard about some of the dangers and some of the pitfalls about nuclear power, and so now I'd like to invite Rosie Hampton of Friends of the Earth Scotland. She focuses largely on just transitions to renewable energies, so we can finish on a positive note towards a more sustainable future. Over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Rosie and I'm the Just Transition campaigner at Friends of the Earth Scotland. We campaign for a fast and fair transition away from fossil fuels and nuclear towards publicly owned renewable energy sources. Our experience of just transition work has mainly been focused on doing kind of deep engagement work with workers in offshore oil and gas and on onshore infrastructure as well. And also my colleagues do various different parts of work across transport and with circular economy. So our focus at the moment is less on workers in nuclear power stations, but hopefully as we kind of think collectively together, there'll be some kind of transferable points on the general principles and ways in which we can achieve a just transition that will be useful here. And also what we should be transitioning to is also a key part of our work. Because I think when we're talking about phasing out of something, it's really helpful in terms of campaigning to have that positive vision. So for us, that's publicly owned renewable energy. So the presentation is structured around why we want it, why we need it, and why we can have it. I'll try and be as positive as possible, although there is some criticism of the Scottish Government to come. So I'll be talking broadly about why we make the case for public ownership of renewable energy and why that distinction is really important. Be talking kind of broadly about just transition principles, approach and process, and also thinking through reflecting on some of the work that we've done with offshore workers in the past, which, hopefully could be applied in different high carbon industries or industries like nuclear. Some criticisms of the Scottish Government approach and ways in which we can kind of act now in some of the work and campaigns that we're doing at Friends of the Earth Scotland. So for anyone that's not familiar with the term just transition, we use it to think about both the process of fossil fuel phase out and the outcome. So we talk about the ways in which that's kind of enabled through dialogue with workers, trade unions, communities, and also what we transition to. So it was a concept that was born within the trade union movement, actually from some Canadian trade unionists who were working in uranium mining in the 1960s, but it's kind of taken on speed more so into the 1990s, and obviously with the past kind of 5 to 6 years or so with the establishment of the Just Transition Commission in Scotland and those kind of principles being legally enshrined through the Climate Change Act. Scotland has talked a lot about just transition, but whether or not it's been realised to any great extent, I'll talk a little bit about as well. There are broad kind of definitions that focus a lot on the labour aspect of the process. So you can see the International Trade Union Confederation definition here about it being based on social dialogue between workers and their unions, employers, governments, communities. And it means that we should provide and guarantee better and decent jobs, equal terms and conditions, and job security for all workers who are affected by global warming and climate change policies. And we at Friends of the Earth Scotland also talk about just transition going beyond jobs. It's incredibly important that workers who have been historically employed in these high carbon industries are transitioned out and have kind of clear pathways with those barriers removed. But it also means looking beyond just people moving from job to job. It's looking at the communities that have relied on these industries for a long time. In Scotland, we might think of that as the Northeast for offshore oil and gas, or you look at kind of onshore infrastructure, such as the discussions around Grangemouth, Mossmoran. It's also looking at the broader community definitions of just transition as well, which are really important. And I'll give some specific as to what that can look like through reference to the work that we've done with offshore workers in the past as well. So I'm sure that this is not, we're kind of preaching to the converted here when it comes to why renewables, but generally they, as we all know, are a better bet for any new vision of kind of energy systems in Scotland and energy democracy as well. It's cheaper for the consumer, it's cheaper in terms of savings, in terms of the cost, and generally is just something that is the way in which we can build kind of the sustainable things. Oil and gas has been on the decline for a long time, and demonstrably renewable green jobs are being created more at pace than the kind of conditions that we see in kind of fossil fuels. And the kind of health benefits, it's already been kind of alluded to, the negatives when it comes to things like oil and gas or nuclear, but renewables is the future in which we need to be kind of focusing on. And that capacity is growing in Scotland, but in a way that is contrary to kind of some of those principles of just transition and leading us down a kind of worrying path. And that's why we advocate kind of so strongly for those resources to be in public ownership for the public good. And this is both a proactive and reactive approach based off what we view as the vision for kind of energy democracy, and also because of the way in which the Scottish Government has acted throughout the transition so far. Some of you might know that at the last ScotWind leasing round, which was where offers were put in by various companies to secure part of Scotland's kind of offshore wind bed, that was essentially a mass process of privatisation. I think nearly 90% of that capacity is now owned by private companies, and where those companies are public companies, they are not based in Scotland. So that is a massive privatising, selling off of one of our natural resources, which is really problematic for the reasons that are inferred through what I'm about to say here. So as we're aware, private ownership is massively driven by the motive of profit. So energy decisions are made on that basis rather than for the benefits of workers, communities, and the planet. The cost of living crisis exemplified this in recent years, but I think it's a long-term story, as we're all aware, of why, when you have to make strategic decisions to put people before profit, private companies are never going to act in that interest. Also, public ownership, especially at a local and community level, could allow that money to be raised from energy generation invested back into those same communities, which when you look at how kind of local authority budgets have been slashed over even just the most recent kind of budget proposals, this could be a massively important ways of securing local revenue generation for underfunded local communities, which really kind of adheres to that principle of just transition about no worker or no community left behind. When it comes to kind of planning around the radical climate action we need, we talk about, the scale that needs to happen is equivalent to something like setting up the NHS or, kind of being on crisis level planning. And with the privatized and fragmented system with incoherent service provision, that is just, you're starting off on a losing footing from the beginning. So that kind of, kind of state-led, government kind of subsidized and funded process instead is what is able to kind of deliver that system-wide radical change we need, rather than relying on private companies who often need to be, subsidized for kind of these renewable investments by public investment anyway. So why is that public investment not just kind of managed and controlled from the base in the first place? And also, it's just a kind of key principle of energy democracy, putting the decision-making power with the people who deserve to have it. Our kind of fellow company or organization Platform in London, who we worked on the offshore workers kind of engagement with, have released some research recently that demonstrates just how much more revenue can be generated in communities like the Northeast when public ownership is at the heart of it, compared when these different things are kind of privately owned as well. So that is kind of the distinction that we make. And it's also, from what we've seen, a core demand of offshore energy workers when it comes to how the energy transition should be managed. This is just a brief kind of poster of the demands that were created when we were working on our power report, which we spent a number of years surveying and engaging with offshore oil and gas workers. And then we hosted a series of workshops that came up with 10 demands for the energy transition. These were all vetted by a core group of kind of offshore workers before being surveyed by around 1,500. And each demand was overwhelmingly supported by over 90% of the workers that were surveyed. And when it comes to the question of energy, public ownership was a really key part of that. So when we think about these principles and we think about who is calling for a publicly owned system of energy, it's the people that have the expertise and the experience to lead the transition in that way, and that's who we should be listening to. But where's the Scottish Government in all of this? I think today is an apt day to be talking about this. Just last week, we saw that they'd abandoned their 2030 climate targets, which they've quickly said were, unachievable anyway, which is simply not true. They were perfectly achievable when they were set, but the lack of radical action has meant that, they've had to kind of face the music on that, when really, this idea that it was an inevitability is completely false, especially considering that they've just not been entirely, they've been completely unserious about all of action so far. Every just transition plan that they've promised has been delayed. Every time that we've given kind of consultation and feedback and different kind of stakeholders have been involved in the process, they've turned around and said, okay, we can tell you that the new plan will not be that different. And the practical infrastructure that's needed to support this energy transition, they're simply not putting enough money on the table to invest in it. A recent STUC report exposed the fact that actually they've committed 600 million of public investment to the ScotWind leasing round to support those private companies if they fulfill on their investment commitments, which the penalties for if they don't do that are woefully low. So that's another worry in and of itself. But supposedly, if the different manufacturers do follow through on their investment commitments in Scottish wind manufacturing in Scotland, there could be a potential for 25,000 jobs. However, the STUC have estimated that we need 19 fabrication yards domestically created within Scotland to be able to support that. We currently have none. There are 2 in development in Scotland at the moment, or in plans. So that lack of, and the investment that's been promised so far will do nothing to kind of add to that. So there's a clear lack of matching up in the kind of rhetoric that they like to produce about being a climate leader and actually what action they take on the ground. And I think we're seeing the very stark repercussions of that. And just to flag one of our key campaigns, I won't go into it just now, but that is also going to be, it will come to crunch time again, because SSE Thermal and Equinor have proposed a new gas power station at Peterhead with carbon capture and storage, and the decision-making powers for that lie with the Scottish Government, and they have, refused to meet with us on a number of occasions, refused to talk about live planning applications, all the while they entertain SSE fairly regularly. And the fact that they're even considering this in line with what's been announced over the past week shows how deeply unserious they are about taking action on a just transition, given that the Peterhead gas plant is one of Scotland's biggest polluters. There's a chance that both plants could run at the same time for a number of years. It's deeply worrying, and that is what makes up our kind of core campaign to be able to focus on to kind of stop that. So I'll just conclude there. I think we can have a publicly owned energy system that's based in renewable energy sources. It reduces costs. It demonstrably creates jobs when the kind of infrastructure is put in place to set them up, and the trade unions are empowered through that process to set up strong sector-wide collective bargaining agreements. But it takes the political will to create it, and frankly, in that case, the Scottish Government are on track for disaster. But as we've experienced across the past number of years of working with offshore oil and gas workers, is that there is a lot of potential for cross-movement working on this, whether it's through the environmental and climate justice movement into the trade union movement. That is a difficult set of work, but it has been done, and we've been doing it, and it's been growing from kind of the grassroots and the rank and file members across to other relevant kind of social movements. So and these are the people that need to be at the heart of the transition. So that being built from the bottom up is the way in which it needs to be done anyway, and creating the kind of momentum that makes it impossible for the Scottish Government to ignore, even in the chaos of it.